Hi everybody, I want to talk to you today, if I may, about DNA. But as I was going through the notes that I got from the Great White Brotherhood, I noticed that they spoke about the illusionary world that we live in. They've sort of linked the two together, DNA and this illusionary world. And so I thought that I had better spend a little bit of time talking about this illusionary world for those who don't know about it. And it's actually quite complicated, so you'll have to bear with me, because the original notes that I got from the Great White Brotherhood was over 20 pages long, and I can't possibly read all that to you, so I'm just going to give you a sort of a resume off the top of my head from what I remember. So I'll talk to you about this illusionary world first of all. And so let's go right back to the beginning. Before everything was created, there was absolutely nothing. Now, it's very difficult to imagine nothing. No space, no time, no air, no gravity, no planets, nothing at all. But there was something we call God. And God created in his mind curiosity, and so he wanted to learn. Obviously, I'm simplifying the thing a bit, but what he first created in this nothingness was 8 bands of frequency, rather like as if you've got 8 channels on a TV station pumping out these different bandwidth things that they do, okay? Now, in these 8 bandwidths, in these 8 frequencies, all separate one from the other, there was nothing, okay? So, in the very highest one, that we'll call the 8th, he had the idea of making planets and things, or worlds, much as you see them down here, with mountains and lakes and rivers and fields and all the rest of it. And then he put a very early form of animal in them, and then man. Now, this, you must remember, is all in the astral realms. There's nothing physical, but because the astral realms when you're in them, they look real. All this looked real to the beings that were in there, okay? Although it would be invisible to our eyes. But anyway, there was all this in the 8th. And then, for reasons we won't go into, he asked for volunteers to come down to the 7th plane. Now, once again, there was nothing in this 7th plane, so he made a copy of all that he'd made in the 8th plane, all the mountains and rivers and goodness knows what, all the galaxies and everything, and much as you see it today. And he asked for volunteers to come down, and he put them in the 7th. There was a reason for this, but we won't go into that now. Then along came some beings that we call Ark Angels. Now, these archangels, you can't imagine. They're nothing to do with men. There are people that become archangels eventually, but these are a different type of being totally. We can't possibly imagine what they look like if they could be seen. But God created these archangels, and he asked them to give man different attributes that would enable man to think and to imagine and so on. So in the 6th plane, which was empty, the archangels created something called imagination. Now, obviously, imagination is not a physical sort of thing. It's a mental thing. It's an emotion thing. But they filled the 6th plane with this thing called imagination and linked it to man in the 7th plane. So man could now imagine. Man could think about things and start to think ahead of what they would do, rather than, for instance, up until that moment, they would have had to find out that fire was hot. They'd have had to put their fingers in the fire and find out that it burnt. But now they could imagine that it would hurt, if you see what I mean. Okay, I'm going through this very quickly, but I have no choice at the moment. Now, then they thought about the fifth plane, which was also empty. And in that, they created something we call our higher self. And higher self, although we all think that we have a version of higher self, and we do to a certain extent, but there's actually only one higher self, just as there's actually only one imagination. This is very difficult to understand, and I haven't got time to go into it or to really explain it, so you either accept what I'm saying or not. So now we've got the eighth plane with a certain amount of life in it. We've got the seventh plane with life in it. We've got the sixth plane with the imagination in it. And we have the fifth plane with higher self in it. Now, higher self is linked to the God force and it's really our connection to God. Okay, it's much more than that, but it's our connection to God. And so they linked this once again to the people in the seventh plane. And then, excuse me, and then they came down to the fourth dimension, and they created, all this is happening over vast eons of time, as you can possibly imagine. Anyway, they came down to the fourth plane, and in that they put what exists to this day, what we call heaven and hell and all the rest of it. Now, from the seventh plane, oh no, I missed a step, the most important step. They realized that God wanted a physical universe created, because all this was done in the astral realms. Okay, now they realized that God wanted a physical universe like we see around us here. So that the Ark Angels scratched their heads and tried to come up in the third dimension with a physical universe. But they actually found that this was impossible, because the leap from the seventh dimension, where there was all the mountains and planets and rivers and lakes and people, all in this astral sense, the jump from that frequency down to the third frequency was too much, and even the archangels couldn't do it. So they abandoned the idea of creating a physical universe in the third dimension, and they scratched their heads, and they realized eventually that in the sixth dimension, which is the one where imagination is housed, they could create an imaginary universe that looked real but wasn't. So what they did was, from the seventh, they made a carbon copy, a bit like you can do in a computer, copy and paste. They copied the entire seventh plane universe. It's still there, but they made a copy of it and put that down in the sixth dimension, because it's just below the seventh, so the change wasn't very much, but it's still in astral form. It's not physical, it's astral. And then in the fourth dimension, they got people from the seventh dimension and brought them down into the fourth dimension, where over long periods of time, these people were trained to be able to live in a physical universe. Okay, now this is all very confusing, I'm sure, but bear with me, because I'll get through it eventually. Now, these people that were in the fourth dimension were being trained to experience life in a physical universe, with all the good and the bad that goes on, and all the pain and the suffering and all the rest of it that we go through in physicality. And then said to these people, listen, we're actually going to not put you in a physical universe because we failed to make one, but we're going to put you in an imaginary universe in the 6th dimension, but we're going to ask you to believe that it's real. And in order to do that, we're going to wipe your memories, so when you go there, you have no memory that you're actually living in an imaginary universe. To you, it will appear real. Now, I'm going to stop there for a moment and go back to something I could and should have perhaps mentioned earlier. When they created this universe, this imaginary universe in the 6th dimension, this copy of the 7th dimension that I mentioned, that is the moment that scientists call the Big Bang. It suddenly appeared out of nowhere because the Ark Angels copied the 7th dimension universe and merely stuck it, pasted it, if you like, into the 6th dimension. And so it suddenly appeared. That's why scientists scratch their heads and wonder how the Big Bang happened and where it all came from. It was a copy of something that was already existing in the 7th. And then they wiped the memories of people that had volunteered to go into this so-called physicality, and people appeared and still appear in what they think is a real world, the world you see around you. People often wonder, why have I got no memory of where I was before? And the reason is that the Ark Angels wipe your memory when you come out of the 4th dimension, where you've been trained to exist in physicality, and you appear in the 6th dimension in this illusionary world, but you think is real because it appears real. And it's true, it does appear real. Now, I've quickly gone through that, and I do apologise that it was all a jumble, but I don't have the time to do much more. What I will say is I think that one should not try and live in this illusionary world because, for instance, to give a silly example, if you were on the edge of a busy street and there's cars rushing up and down and you say, none of this is real, I'm just going to walk across, you'll very quickly get hit by something and find that it does appear real because you'll get either very quickly injured or possibly killed. The same if you get bills, if you get a gas bill or electricity bill or whatever, and you say, this is not real, I'm not going to pay this, you'll very quickly find yourself in trouble. So my advice and what I do is, although I know about this illusionary world we live in, I live in it as if it's real because I'm here, I'm in it, and I've got to live as if it is reality, although I know that it is illusion. Okay, now, I don't know whether you understood all that, but I felt obliged to explain it because what I want to talk about now is DNA. And for some reason, the Great White Brotherhood linked DNA to this illusionary world. Anyway, DNA, let's get on with that. Now, this was actually written back in July of 2017, which we're in. It's November, the end of November 2017 at the moment that I'm making this little video. And somebody must have asked me a question. I don't really remember, but the answer is actually somebody must have asked me a question about DNA and higher self. And I'll read you what there is because it talks about DNA. The connection between DNA and higher self is not quite as was imagined and described previously, I suppose. Our higher self is a purely spiritual force that will never be made manifest in the physical plane referred to as Earth. So your higher self, which is in the 5th dimension, will always remain in the 5th dimension and never come into physicality, okay? It must be realized that the 3D world that one observes is not actually a real construct in a solid sense. It is an imaginary world that our collective minds construct in order for us to have a base to incarnate to, but it is imaginary, as I just explained, or tried to explain. However, our higher self, although invisible, is real. So, in a way, what we experience is topsy-turvy. Most people think that the higher self is imaginary, but that 3D, this where we live, is real. In fact, life is round the other way. The higher self is real, even if invisible, whereas this 3D world is a figment of our imagination, even though it appears solid. This being so, the DNA that we can measure in 3D must also be a figment of our imagination, though appears real and measurable. DNA does not stop with a sample of blood or tissue. It, too, has auras just like everything else. These auras go to ever higher planes of reality so that at the highest level, the DNA of a person is of very much the same vibration as the higher self. But it is not connected to higher self, as higher self is real, whereas DNA is imaginary. DNA exists in order to give each person, animal, plant, rock, planet, galaxy, an identity in the 3D world perceived as solid. Okay, now already all this is a bit confusing because they're going backwards and forwards between the imaginary world that we actually live in and what we perceive as real. So, and they're also saying that everything has DNA. Even a rock has DNA. It's just that our scientists have not found the means of measuring it yet, but everything is one. So even a galaxy has got DNA. Okay? Now, in the spiritual world, DNA does not exist. So it is important to understand that everything physical has DNA, but that DNA is there to give each object, no matter what it is in the physical plane, a unique identity, a sort of calling card, despite it being made of flesh, vegetable matter, or stone. All is vibration, so all is the same. A person or a rock are basically the same as they are made of similar vibration. It is the DNA that helps people differentiate people from stones. Also, as you know, through DNA, each person has a unique identity, and each rock or stone has a unique identity. Even a grain of sand on a beach has a unique identity. Jesus understood this when he mentioned that every feather of a bird was known to God. He was talking about the identity that DNA gives. Once an incarnation is finished, the physical form is finished, and the DNA is no longer required. In the heavenly spheres, individualization is no longer required. Life comes together in unity, and division is finished. So the higher self has a task which is to direct the spiritual aspect of life as it progresses towards perfection, whereas DNA has the function of telling each cell of the body what it is. It was mentioned in another talk that at the time of creation of an object, the directors of life put a stamp, a logos, on the Spirit of God that tells it what it is destined to be. And if you've followed any of my other talks and things, you will remember that the Spirit of God is just actually a life force and can be made into anything: a raindrop, a snail, a horse, a galaxy, whatever. But once it's got this little stamp on it, then it knows what it's going to be. It's going to be a raindrop. It's going to be a horse. It's going to be a planet. It's going to be a human or whatever. Okay? At that moment, if the object is destined to have a 3D existence on Earth, the beginnings of its DNA at the highest level is created, which will eventually form a visible object on Earth, each one of which, from the tiniest grain of sand to the whole galaxy, has a unique identity. In fact, one could say that each atom has DNA, and each atom has a unique identity. If man had the ability to quantify DNA sufficiently, he would find out that not only mammals and insects have DNA, but rocks, stones, sand, earth, and every other thing has DNA, as all is one. But it is noticed that not only is the DNA of a human different from that of a horse, a pig, a dog, and so on, but because, just to think about humans, each human has a sense of individuality, which is a spiritual attribute, that creates in the DNA two parts. One part is the sequencing that denotes a human as opposed to something else, but I'll say that again. One part is the sequencing that denotes a human, but part two contains, amongst other things, the individual sequence applicable to each person. The same would of course apply to everything incarnate in the galaxy that has individual awareness. That's how the police, if there's been a crime, can tell A, that the crime was done by a human, and B, who that human is. Okay, so there is only one God Spirit, which is linked to higher self for all things, but for all things incarnate, there is DNA that denotes the species. For all things that have a sense of individuality, there is more DNA that denotes that individual. Last page. Now, there is much confusion about the DNA thing. As you know, something like 90% of our DNA is unused and is considered junk DNA. The human body doesn't work like that, and nothing is wasted. This unused DNA is connected with consciousness. At the moment, most people use just enough DNA to keep body and soul together, and the rest lies dormant. However, this is changing and is part of the ascension movement. As we rise in consciousness, so we start to activate parts of the dormant DNA. Now, I don't know, hang on. There's some personal information here for the person who wrote the question, but let's go on. I think that the hope was that as people felt themselves becoming more spiritually awake and aware, they would get their DNA tested, see that they still only had 2 strands, get disillusioned and drop the ascension idea as a fairy story and return to their asleep state spirituality. Because people think that as we become more advanced spiritually, so we will have more and more strands of DNA. That is not true and is not going to happen. We've got 2 strands, and we will always only have 2 strands. However, the dormant DNA will activate and link to the original 2 strands, and the result will be heightened awareness spiritually, plus an increase in our ability to use the gifts of the Spirit, telepathy, telekinesis, teleportation, and so on. Now, that's the end of this long drawn-out talk. I will just mention, if I may, that we've got 2 books available that you can get as PDF files on our Great White Brotherhood site, and you've got The Stairway to Freedom, which you can see on the screen there, and The Path to Mankind, The Path of Mankind, which you can see there. Now, I think that's about all I want to say, really. Thank you very much for listening to all this. I don't know if you understood it all. Certainly it's very, very complicated, particularly the bit about this illusionary world that we live in. I will just repeat, even if you think that this really is just an illusionary world, please act as if it was a real world. Otherwise, you could get things going wrong in your life. Certainly I treat this world as if it was real, even though I know that it's all just an illusion. Okay, so thank you very much for listening and watching. Any questions, please ask, and I'll do my best to answer, as always, and I'll speak to you again another day on another topic. Okay, bye.